£7, said Mr. Sculthorpe, and he read it out to the table rather than to the woman it concerned. Being the value of such lead as remains upon the roofs, the seasoned oak of 4 doors, and the dressed stone of the chapel steps, less the cost of taking them down and carting them into Hollenbeck. The castle of Ravensmoor, with the site thereof, the chapel and burial vault, and all deeds, evidences, and muniments relating thereto. That, Miss Aubrey, is the whole of your third. The long parlour at Bramling Park held 14 people that March morning in 1837, and Hester Aubrey had the stool by the door, because every chair in the room had been taken before she was called in. She was 22. Her father had been 7 weeks in the ground. She sat with her hands folded and her spine off the back of nothing at all, and she did not move while the laugh went round the room, which it did the way a drought goes round a house, starting with the 2 husbands by the fire, running along the wall where the tenants stood holding their hats, and coming back to her at last from the direction of her own sisters. "It is a castle, Hester," said Diana. Diana was the eldest, 31, married 4 years to Mr. Osbert Chaffant of the Hollenbeck Bank, and she had the good chair with the fire at her shoulder. Not one woman in 1,000 can say she owns a castle. I do think you might look a little pleased. "It has no roof over the hall," said Hester. "It has a roof over the gatehouse," said Sophia, the second sister, 28, married to a clergyman with expectations. "Papa always said the gatehouse was sound." "Papa never went there," said Hester. "Then you will be the first of us to make any use of it," said Diana, which is more than either of us can say, and that was when the room got its proper laugh. A good one. A solid one. And Hester Aubrey sat in the middle of it and counted the panes in the window opposite until it stopped. Here is what had been taken, and how it was done, because it was done politely, and it was done in writing, and there was never a single moment in it that a magistrate could have objected to. Marcus Aubrey of Bramling Park died in January 1837, worth 1,100 acres of the Vale of Marl, a good stone house, a name in the county for 140 years, and a will drawn in 1830 that left his real estate to his 3 daughters as tenants in common, to be divided among them by such deed of partition as they should agree between themselves. He had 3 daughters, and he loved them equally, and he had never in his life imagined that 2 of them would agree between themselves before the 3rd was out of mourning. Diana had a husband who was a banker. Sophia had a husband who was a clergyman with a brother-in-law who was a banker. Hester had a good law hand and no husband at all, and therefore nobody at the table but herself. The valuation was got up from a stranger in the assize town, which was Diana's own idea, so that nobody in the county could ever say the family had been unfair. The schedule ran to 4 pages. Bramling Park, the home farm, and the 7 farms of the Vale went to Diana and Sophia in equal moieties, subject to charges. The plate, the pictures, the long case clock, and the library went with the house, and the 3rd lot, the whole of Hester's share, was a single line: the Castle of Ravensmoor, £7. The Aubreys had held it since 1809, when Hester's grandfather bought it out of the wreck of the Ravensmoor estate for £400, and let the whole county call him a fool. No Aubrey had ever slept in it. No Aubrey had ever taken a tenant out of it. Nobody had done anything with it at all, except pay the land tax and keep the gatehouse roof whole, which Marcus Aubrey had done every single year of his life without ever saying why, and which nobody had thought to ask him about while he was alive to answer. Hester signed the deed. She has been asked about that a great many times since, and her answer never varied. She signed it, because refusing would have cost her 4 years in Chancery, and about £900 she did not have, and because a woman of 22 with no money who fights her family in public is not a woman with a grievance, she is a woman with a reputation. So she signed. And Mr. Sculthorpe blotted it. And Mr. Chalfont poured himself a third glass of his late father-in-law's Madeira before 11 in the morning, and then he said the thing that the Vale of Marl would still be repeating 40 years later. "You had better take the papers along with it," he said. "There's a mort of Ravensmoor stuff in the muniment room, boxes of it, and Sculthorpe says, there's not a shilling of value in the lot, deeds to land that was sold before you were born. Take it, Hester. Take the whole heap. It's only fit for lighting fires." And Diana said, Osbert, in the voice a woman uses when her husband has said the true thing instead of the kind one. And then, because she was nothing if not thorough, she rang and had it done. They tipped the Ravensmoor muniments into a wheelbarrow in the stable yard, 4 japanned boxes, 2 deed chests, a sack of loose parchment, 3 court rolls, and a bundle of blue paper in a hat box. A groom wheeled it out to the lane and left it on the verge. Hester Aubrey borrowed a handcart from the Bramling carpenter on the promise of a shilling she did not yet have, and pushed her entire inheritance 7 miles up the valley to the castle of Ravensmoor. And it took her from noon until dark. She got her first sight of the place at the bend by Adderstone Locks, with the light nearly gone. It is a mile off from there, and it stands up out of the water meadow with nothing between, and what she saw was a black bulk 4 stories high against a sky the colour of pewter. The gatehouse tower, the long ruined hall range with its 7 tall windows blank as knocked-out teeth, 2 round drum towers, a curtain wall down in 3 places, and above the whole of it a roof line sagging into the sky where the lead had gone. It was enormous. It was also perfectly unlit, top to bottom, dark as the hill behind it. Except for 1 window, down at the near end of the range at ground level, in the little chapel with the squat bell turret, 1 tall traceried window was burning a deep, steady amber, the only warm thing in 11 miles of frozen valley. Somebody was in there. And she stood on the frost-rutted drive with a handcart full of waste paper and a canvas bag over her shoulder, and she thought, quite clearly, and without any drama at all, well, somebody is in there. If you have come this far with Hester Aubrey, stay with me, because everything the Vale of Marl still argues about begins on the other side of that chapel door, and I would rather not tell it to an empty room. Subscribe, and I will tell you what was in there. What was in there was an old man with a lamp. Jonas Creed was 81 years old, sexton of the parish of Adderstone, and he had walked up that drive at dusk every night for 36 years to fill and light a lamp in the chapel of a castle nobody owned and nobody used. In frost, in flood, on Christmas night, on the night his wife died. He did it, he said, because he was paid for it. Paid by whom, she asked. He said the man was dead. Paid how much? She asked. He put his hand in his waistcoat and brought out a guinea of 1798, worn smooth on one side from 36 years of a thumb going over it. And he said that. And I've never been able to spend it, miss. And I've never been able to say why. And I'd take it kindly if you didn't ask me twice. She did not ask him twice. She was cold and she had nowhere to sleep, and Jonas Creed helped her carry a mattress and a wheelbarrow of paper up the gatehouse stair, and that is how Hester Aubrey came to Ravensmoor. The gatehouse gave her 2 rooms over the carriage arch, with a floor and a roof and a chimney that drew. Everything else in that castle was sky. The winter of 1837 was the hard one, the one the county still dated things by, and she got through it on 3 things. The first was work. She walked into Hollenbeck and offered her hand to every attorney on the marketplace, and the only one who took her was Mr. Cuthbert Nangle, 63, deaf in one ear, disliked by every good family in the county, who looked at her copy of a mortgage for 4 minutes and said, "8 pence a skin, you'll spell nothing your own way, and I don't care whose daughter you are." She copied for him 3 days a week for 2.5 years. Conveyances, settlements, releases, private acts, the recitals of railway prospectuses. She could not have paid for that education at any price. It was the making of her, and neither of them ever once acknowledged it. She learned in that office the 3 things that decided everything afterwards. She learned that the recitals at the front of a deed are where a man tells you, without meaning to, what he was afraid of. She learned that the operative words are almost never the words anybody in the room is looking at. And she learned, copying out the private act of a water company for a client who was disputing a wharf, that the men who run a great undertaking have very rarely read the act that created it, because they were not there when it was made, and they inherit it the way a man inherits a staircase, as a thing that is simply in the house. The second thing was food, which was mostly potatoes, and what Jonas Creed's daughter-in-law sent up. The third thing was fire, and that is the part of this story you need to hold on to. There was no fuel at Ravensmoor, not a stick. The park had been cut over in 1811, the coal came up from Hollenbeck at 1 shilling and 8 pence a hundredweight, and she was earning about 4 shillings a week. What she had was a wheelbarrow, and 4 japanned boxes and 2 deed chests, and a sack full of dry parchment and paper that her brother-in-law had told her in front of witnesses was only fit for lighting fires. So she burned it. All that winter she burned her own muniments, sheet by sheet, one at a time, sitting on the floor with her back against the chimney breast. And because it was the only reading matter in the building, she read every single sheet before it went on the fire. Court rolls of the Manor of Ravensmoor, a survey of 1743, letters about a lawsuit over a mill dam, bills for a roof, receipts for 190 loads of stone. She read them all in the same flat voice in her head, and then she fed them into the grate and warmed her hands. And by the middle of December there was 1 japanned box and the hat box left, and that was going to be the end of January. And on the 14th of December 1837, with 4 candles left in the house, and a paper in her hand, and the grate 3 feet away, she read a memorandum in a small crabbed 18th century hand that said this, that on the 12th day of November 1801, the sum of 4 guineas had been paid to 4 men for the carriage of the coffin of Mr. Sylvanus Ord into the vault beneath the chapel, together with 2 shillings for candles. And Hester Aubrey stopped with the sheet an inch from the fire, because 11 words had just come back to her that she had not thought about in 8 years. Her mother died in the spring of 1829, when Hester was 14. Grace Aubrey had almost nothing of her own to leave, because a married woman in 1829 owned nothing of her own to leave, and her will was 3 lines long and was read out in the same parlour at Bramling Park in front of the whole family. She left her clothes to be divided. She left her wedding ring to Diana as the eldest, and she left, to her youngest daughter Hester when she should come of age, her father's silver watch and the keeping of the chapel at Ravensmoor. The keeping of the chapel at Ravensmoor. There was a chapel at Ravensmoor, and it was not consecrated parish ground, it was a private chapel in a private castle, and Grace Aubrey had no more power to leave the keeping of it than she had to leave the moon. Hester's father had said gently, "Your mother was very ill at the end." Diana had said it was a pity, and had taken the ring. Everybody had agreed that it was a sad old fancy, and that poor Grace had wandered, and in 8 years not one person in that family, including Hester, had spoken the sentence aloud again. Grace Aubrey's father was Josiah Weald, and Josiah Weald had been steward at Ravensmoor to the 4th Earl. He died in 1822, and his daughter sat with him for the last 4 days. What he told her in those 4 days, she wrote down in a receipt book in her own hand in a plain enough form, that he had been one of 4 men who carried a coffin down into the Ravensmoor vault in November 1801 with the Earl himself holding the light and no clergyman present at all, that they had each been given a guinea and told to forget it, that there was no dead man of that name in the parish and never had been, and that the coffin, which they carried down 7 steps with a rope under it, was light. Grace Weald married Marcus Aubrey in 1813. From 1822 she knew, and from 1822 she could do precisely nothing, and this is the part that people misunderstand about her. She was not timid. She was correct. Everything a married woman touched in 1822 belonged the same hour to her husband. If Grace had raised it, the value of it would have been her husband's absolutely, and on his death would have gone wherever his will and his elder daughter's husbands directed, which is exactly where it went in March 1837. She could not hold it. She could not sell it. She could not tell her husband without giving it away. And she could not tell a solicitor without telling her husband. What she could do was leave it, in public, in a will, to the one child who had nothing, and was likely to keep having nothing, in language so mild that nobody would ever contest it, and she could ask her father's oldest friend to keep a light burning in the chapel, so that the place did not fall in, and pay him with the only guinea in the world that man would not spend. Grace Aubrey died 7 years before she could tell her daughter to her face. Hester put the memorandum down without burning it. Then she went to the parish chest at Adderstone with Jonas Creed and the churchwarden and got out the burial register for 1801, and there it was in the incumbent's hand, the 12th of November, Sylvanus Ord, of this parish, gentleman, aged 61 years. There was no baptism of that name in the register. No marriage. No settlement examination, no rate, no entry in the militia list, no such person in the assessed taxes, no such name anywhere in the Vale of Marl in any book that survived. A gentleman of 61 years, of this parish, who had never once been born, married, taxed, or seen. She asked Jonas Creed, and he sat down on the chest and put his hands on his knees and said, "I was 13. I was the 4th man, because Weald's boy had a broke arm, and they wanted somebody light on the front end going down. And she said, 'Was it heavy?' and Jonas Creed said, "Miss a man of 61 years, in an inner lead and an oak shell, 4 of us. That's a heavy load down 7 steps in the wet. I've carried a many. That one I could have carried on my own hip. Opening a coffin is a serious thing, and Hester Aubrey went about it properly, which is one of the reasons the county could never afterwards make it disgraceful. The chapel was private and unconsecrated, and she owned it, so no faculty was needed. Mr. Nangle wrote her an opinion to that effect and charged her 4 shillings. She had the incumbent of Adderston there, and the churchwarden, and Mr. Nangle himself, and a surgeon from Hollenbeck to say what was in it, and Jonas Creed, and 2 labourers, and she had the whole thing written down and signed as it happened. And on the 6th of February, 1838, at 10:30 in the morning, Tobias Kell went down 7 steps with a lamp and a cold chisel. Kell was a bargeman. He had been put out of a towpath cottage at Adderstone the previous autumn by the Duke of Halbury's agent, along with 10 other families, because the navigation company had decided it was cheaper not to repair them, and he was working that winter for whatever anyone would pay. The vault held 7 coffins on stone shelves, and the 7th one had a lead plate that said Sylvanus Ord 1801 and nothing else, no age, no text, no ornament. Kell went round the lead with the chisel and folded the sheet back, and the oak inside was sound and dry, and he took the screws out one at a time and put them in his cap. And inside there was no body. There was an iron-bound chest, 4 feet by 2, wedged with oak blocks so it would not shift on the carry. That was the moment the whole thing should have arrived. That was the moment everyone in that vault, including Hester Aubrey, had been walking toward since the 14th of December. Kell got the lid up. Inside the chest was a pair of steel spectacles, a dry inkhorn with the ink gone to a black crust, a folded linen bag with nothing in it, and about 4 pounds weight of blue paper and parchment tied into bundles with pink tape gone the color of weak tea. No coin, no plate, no jewels, nothing that any person standing in that crypt could put a value on. The surgeon from Hollenbeck said, "Well, there's no corpse, which is the main thing," and went up. One of the labourers laughed, not unkindly, and went up. The incumbent said something about how it was a great pity, and how she was not to be blamed for trying, and went up. And Hester Aubrey sat down on the 7th step of her own crypt with the lamp beside her, and understood, with complete clarity, that she had broken open a coffin in front of 6 witnesses on the strength of a sentence in the will of a woman everybody agreed had died wandering, and that by Sunday she would be the most ridiculous woman in the Vale of Mall, and that it would be in Hollenbeck by Thursday, and at Bramling Park by Friday. Mr. Cuthbert Nangle did not go up. He was deaf in one ear, and had missed most of the conversation. He was standing at the chest with his spectacles on the end of his nose, holding one bundle of the blue paper about 6 inches from his good eye. And he had been standing like that for rather a long time. What he said eventually was, "Miss Aubrey, come here and tell me what the number on this is. My eyes are gone." And she came and looked and said, 800. And he said, 800, and then he sat down on the 5th step, which for Mr. Nangle was a display of emotion approaching hysteria. It was in Hollenbeck by the Thursday, exactly as she had known it would be. It reached Bramling Park on the Friday, and Diana Chaffont was heard to say, at a dinner of 11 people, that she had always been afraid something of this kind would come, that poor Hester had been living alone in a ruin for a 12-month, with nobody to talk to but an old sexton, that it was their mother over again, and was there anything at all to be done for her? By the end of the month, there was a version going round the market at Hollenbeck that had her digging graves by lamplight in search of treasure, and a version in the parlour behind the bank that had her simply mad, and a curate at Marle Bridge preached upon the vanity of earthly riches with a warmth that every person in that church understood perfectly. Hester Aubrey heard all of it. She walked into Hollenbeck 3 days a week, the whole time, to copy deeds at 8p a skin, past the same shop fronts and the same faces, and she did not correct one word of it to one person for 9 weeks. Partly because Mr. Nangle had told her that a thing said too soon is a thing your opponent is given time to answer, and partly because there were still 3 questions about that blue paper that had not been settled, and until they were settled she had nothing at all. It took 9 weeks, to be sure. It was 800 shares of £100 each in the Company of Proprietors of the Marle Navigation, the letters of allotment of 1794, the receipts for every call, 12 calls, every one paid up in full, the scrip sealed with the company's seal, and at the bottom a deed of 8 skins executed in October 1801, a declaration of trust, by which Aurelian, 4th Earl of Ravensmoor, being possessed of the said 800 shares, declared that he held them upon trust for the owner for the time being of the castle of Ravensmoor, and for no other person whatsoever. He had been ruined by that canal. He had subscribed for 2/5 of it in the mania of 1794, and paid every call out of borrowed money, and by 1801 the creditors were at the door, and the water had not yet reached Adderstone. So he did the one thing a clever, desperate man could do with property his creditors were about to take. He stopped owning it as a man, and made it belong to a building instead. Then he sealed the papers with his own muniments, where a creditor would never look and a purchaser would never care, and he buried them in his own chapel, under the name of a man who had never lived, and told 4 men to forget it, and paid them each a guinea, and died before the water came. His estate was sold up in 1809, his castle, with the site thereof, the chapel and burial vault, and all deeds, evidences and muniments relating thereto, was bought for £400 by a man everyone called a fool, whose son paid the land tax on it for 28 years, and kept a roof on a gatehouse he never slept in, and whose granddaughter got it in March 1837, in a deed of family arrangement drawn by her sister's attorney, valued at £7 and signed by both her sisters and both their husbands, and enrolled in Chancery, so that she could never afterwards come back and say she had been hard done by. That is the thing about a deed. It is very good at doing exactly what it says. Those were the 3 questions, and Mr. Nangle took them in order. Could 800 shares have been forfeited to the company in 36 years of silence? No. The Act of 1793 allowed forfeiture only of shares in arrear upon a call, and these had been paid up to the last penny by 1799, and Mr. Odell's own ledgers said so in Mr. Odell's own hand, and a company cannot forfeit what it has been fully paid for. Could the company resist the transfer on the ground of the delay? No, a trustee's silence does not put an end to a trust. The shares had never stood in any other name from that day to this, and the company had gone on carrying the dividend to a suspense account, for the very good reason that it had always known the money was somebody's. And was the declaration of trust itself good, executed by a man with his creditors on the stair? That was the question that took the 9 weeks. The answer was that it did not matter in the least, because the creditors of the 4th Earl of Ravensmoor had been paid 20 shillings in the pound out of the sale of 1809. Every one of them was satisfied, or in his grave, and there was no longer a person alive in England with the standing to complain of it. Now here is the arithmetic that ruined a duke. The Marl navigation was authorized in 1793 with a capital of £200,000 in 2,000 shares. It ran 31 miles from Marl Bridge to the Hollenbeck coalfield. It paid well for 40 years, and by 1838 it was worth more dead than alive, because Ansel, Duke of Halbury, wanted to lay a railway along its towpath. He was not a cruel man, and it matters to be accurate about him. He had never set eyes on the Vale of Marl before 1829, and saw it perhaps twice a year afterwards, from inside a carriage. In the autumn of 1837, his agent, Mr. Breakspeare, wrote to him in London that the 11 towpath cottages at Adderstone stood in such repair as would cost the company £410 to make good, and that the families in them paid 1 shilling and 3 a week between the whole 11. The Duke of Halbury wrote the single word agreed at the foot of that letter and never thought of it again, and in November 11 families came out onto the bank with their furniture beside them in the rain. That is how it is done at that height. Nobody shouts, and nobody is unkind. A man in London writes 1 word at the bottom of a repair account, and a bargeman named Tobias Kell spends the winter in his brother's hayloft with a wife and no work, which is why he was available in February to go down 7 steps with a cold chisel for 2 shillings a day. He had been chairman of the navigation for 9 years. He had spent on surveys, options on land, parliamentary agents, and the quiet purchase of shares about £38,000, and the company's own Act of 1793, which he had certainly never read, and which Mr. Cuthbert Nangle had read 3 times, provided that the undertaking could not be sold, dissolved, or converted to any other use, except with the consent in general meeting of the holders of 3/4 of the shares. 3/4 of 2,000 is 1,500. The Duke of Halbury held 1,050. Every other proprietor in the county held 150 between them, and he had been buying those up for years. Even if he got every last one, he stopped at 1,200. 60%. He had been 60% for 9 years, and in 9 years not one man in his employment had spent a shilling to find out where the other 800 shares had gone, because the company's books said they stood in the name of the 4th Earl of Ravensmoor, deceased, and everybody knew the Ravensmoors were extinct and their estate sold. And nobody had ever asked the next question. Mr. Odell, the company clerk, had gone on carrying the dividend on those 800 shares to a suspense account every half year, as his predecessor had, as the Act required, and by March 1838 that account stood at 19 years of arrears, because the company's private act barred anything older. It was a large account. Mr. Nangle said one thing to her, and said it once: keep it quiet until the general meeting, and go to the meeting yourself. The transfer was lodged with the company on the 11th of May, 1838. Mr. Odell entered it in the register in his own hand, checked it 3 times, and wrote to the chairman, because that is what an honest clerk does. The general meeting was held at the Navigation House in Hollenbeck on the 4th of June. and the resolution before it was the conversion of the undertaking. And the Duke of Halbury came down from London for it, in a carriage with 4 horses, because he expected to carry it. Hester Aubrey walked in from Ravensmoor with a canvas bag over her shoulder. The porter did not want to admit her. Mr. Odell came out into the hall in his shirt sleeves and admitted her, and set a chair for her at the end of the table himself, and that small act cost him nothing in the end, because she made him secretary of the company 2 years later at $400 a year. The chairman read the resolution. The chairman called for the vote. And Mr. Odell stood up and said, "Before the vote, Your Grace, the register was closed on the 1st of June, and there is a transfer on it that the meeting should hear." And he read out that 800 shares standing in the name of Aurelian, 4th Earl of Ravensmoor, deceased, had been transferred in pursuance of a declaration of trust dated the 9th of October 1801 to Miss Hester Aubrey of Ravensmoor Castle in this county, who was present and was the largest single proprietor in the room. There is no record of the Duke of Halbury saying anything at all for some time. What he did eventually say to her, down the length of the table, was, "Madam, what is it you want?" She had it written out. She had had it written out for 9 weeks. The navigation was not to be dissolved and not to be closed. It was to be kept in water and in repair in perpetuity, and the railway could have the land beside it and not the towpath. The 11 cottages at Adderstone were to be rebuilt at the company's charge, and the families put back in them by name. And Tobias Kell's name was first on the list, because she had written it first. A public wharf was to be built at Ravensmoor. The arrears in the suspense account were to be paid over, and she would sell the Duke of Halbury 299 of her 800 shares at £240 apiece, which was the price he had been paying in the market for a year, and she would keep 501. 501. 2,000 shares, a quarter is 500, and one more than a quarter, held forever, means no man alive can ever get his 3/4 without her. Mr. Nangle had worked that out on the back of a bill of costs, and she had made him say it twice. The Duke of Halbury looked at the paper for a long minute, and then he laughed, once, the way a man does when he has been beaten by arithmetic rather than by malice, and he said, "You are quite right, of course. Nobody in 9 years asked me who owned the ground." And he signed. He got his railway. It opened in 1842, and it made him a great deal more money than the canal ever had. And the canal is still there, in water, because a private act of 1793 and a woman with 501 shares said it was to be. Osbert Chalfont did not do so well. The Hollenbeck Bank had been lending on Marl Navigation shares at 240 and better, on the plain reasoning that the Duke must in the end be forced to pay anything at all for the last block, and when the last block turned out to belong to his wife's youngest sister, and to be sold to the Duke at the ordinary market price with no squeeze in it at all, the shares came back to 118 and stayed there. The bank did not fail. It was reconstructed in 1841, and the money that reconstructed it was lent on a mortgage of Bramling Park at 4%, drawn by Mr. Cuthbert Nangle of Hollenbeck, and advanced by Miss Hester Aubrey of Ravensmoor, who did not visit, did not raise the interest in 14 years, and did not foreclose. The Reverend Peregrine Yoxall did not get the living of Adderstone. Diana Chalfont came to Ravensmoor once, in the autumn of 1843, and was shown into the great hall, which by then had a roof on it again, and a floor of Hollenbeck stone, and 7 re-leaded windows that a glazier had taken 5 years over, pane by pane. What the two of them said to each other has never been known, because Hester Aubrey never told anybody, and Diana Chalfont was not a woman who repeated a conversation she had lost. She was there 50 minutes. She was given tea. She went home. The castle took 11 years and something over £40,000. The old cut was dredged, and the barge that had been frozen into it for a generation was raised, rebuilt, and put back to work by Tobias Kell, who owned 3 by 1850. The cartwheel came out of the nettles at the drive head. The glass house came up out of the grass, and in 1846 Hester Aubrey executed a deed of endowment, charging upon the castle of Ravensmoor and its lands a perpetual annuity of £7 a year, payable half-yearly, to the sexton of the parish of Adderstone for the time being, for the keeping of the chapel at Ravensmoor. £7. The exact value her sisters had put upon the whole of her, in front of 14 people, on a March morning in 1837. The lamp is still lit in that chapel every evening. Jonas Creed lived to see the deed sealed at 90, and on the day it was done he came up the drive as he had come up it for 45 years, and he did not bring the lamp oil. He brought the guinea of 1798, worn smooth on one side, and he put it down on the chapel step, and said he could spend it now, only he found he did not want to. It is in a glass case in the gatehouse at Ravensmoor to this day, next to a single sheet of parchment with one corner burnt black, which nobody has ever been able to get the owner of that castle to explain.